This week's biggest news is that it's stopped pissing it down for long enough for someone to actually climb something. Jim Pope, who's recently returned from the World Championships in Bern, has put his good form to good use by making a repeat of James Taylor's E9 6C Olwen at Rhoscolyn and making an on-site ascent of Strawberries, the E7 6C at Tremadog in North Wales. Whilst the second ascent of Olwen is indeed impressive, perhaps more has been made out of his on-site of Strawberries, simply because for many years it was almost believed an impossibility. And we're going to go into a bit of history about that route and its previous ascents and the styles in which they've been done. Prior to its first ascent, Strawberries was known as Peaches, and it was renowned as a long-standing project. And the first ascent was a prize that was being battled out over between two of the leading protagonists of that day, Ron Fawcett and John Redhead. In 1980, Ron won that battle, making the first ascent of Strawberries, grading it E6 6B. And he made the ascent in particularly 1980s style, using means that may not, by at least modern standards, seem all that legit, and even at the time were considered questionable. He climbed the route in yo-yo style over a period of 2 weekends, whereby he'd climb up to a high point, fall off, and leave both his gear and his ropes in. The following weekend, he'd then abseil in, place his gear and his ropes back in that high point and climb from there again, thus wasting no energy. Now, weird though this might sound, you've got to remember that this is in the days prior to head pointing and red pointing being a thing. Pre-practicing routes on a top rope at that time was deemed to be unethical. And whilst yo-yoing was far from ethically sound, it's just the way in which it sort of worked at the time, albeit quite badly. The style of ascent was criticised, with some locals suggesting that had John Redhead have employed the same tactics, he would have done it much sooner. However, Ron's ascent stood and it laid down the benchmarks for people to surpass. In 1982, Johnny Woodward managed to improve on the style, placing the gear on lead, but the biggest breakthrough was in 1987 when Stefan Glovax, visiting German climber, made an on-site ascent. Stefan was over in the UK to finish off his book, Rocks Around the World, and after, in true British style, being rained off a variety of other crags, ended up at Tremadog. In an interview with UKC back in 2008, Stefan told us, "It was the perfect route for me. Not too steep, just slightly overhanging and not all laybacks. I like some face climbing. There was a lot of psychological pressure from the route's reputation and history. The gear is bad, the climbing is hard, that sort of thing. But I was super psyched. I set off up the route completely on-site and found the gear placements were solid, but hard to place. So I made a big run out to the top. I was very confident." This ascent became a part of British climbing folklore, not least because it was the only ascent in this style. And decades went by, and still, despite repeated attempts from some of Britain's and the world's top climbers, including the likes of Jack Geldard, James McAfee, Pete Robbins, and Nico Favresse from Belgium, who's not only climbed Cobra Crack in Squamish, but also French 9A, all failed to make that on-site ascent. This led many to question the E6 grade to the extent that it was eventually upgraded to E7. In fact, it took almost 2.5 decades for the route to receive a second on-site ascent, this time courtesy of Jörg Verhoeven in 2011. And then in 2012, Hans-Jörg Auer made another on-site ascent. In 2014, self-proclaimed weak climber Steve McClure made the first British on-site, thus lifting what was felt by many to be a 30-year curse on the route. This brings us to present day with Jim Pope's ascent, which is made in on-site style, using every ounce of Jim's competition climbing and on-site experience, coupled with some of his trad climbing deviancy that he's built up within recent years. This is a guy with a lot of tricks up his sleeve. Jim told UKC, "I got through the bottom section pretty quickly, but maybe didn't find the best method and was pretty sapped. After placing some good wires, I arrived at the last crack, looking at the last few moves above. By this point, I was redlining and my last wire was a long way below. Pat's cheers of encouragement were gradually getting more and more high-pitched and flustered, so I figured I should try and get something else in. I desperately tried to fiddle in a small cam, but it looked so bad that I didn't even clip it. I stuck the next few moves by the skin of my teeth, and I and Pat were very relieved to top it out. I didn't have the gear in as high as I could have, so the fall from the top crux would have been a big flight. To put the route's overall difficulty into French grades, Strawberries has been mooted at being somewhere around 7B+, 7C. However, Jim told us that he's put more effort into 8C+ red points than he had that route on that day. When it comes to Jim's repeat of Olwen at E9 6C, it's pretty apparent this wall suits Jim's style, as he made a very quick ascent of James Taylor's E10 on that cliff, Prisoners of the Sun. Jim's now up in the Lake District, where he's been working on Dave Burkett's benchmark E9 if 6 was 9. This is considered to be the hardest of Dave Burkett's E9s. And Jim's commented on how much harder and bolder it has been than Olwen. As always, the matter of grades, it's very difficult to assess. Olwen sounds like it potentially suited him with that sustained style of climbing, which benefited from that comp experience that he has. If 6 was 9 just sounds gnarly in comparison, with French 8A+ climbing, and a blade peg and a skyhook protecting the upper crux, and if they did rip, which in all likelihood they probably would, you'd hit a ledge low down. On Instagram, Jim had this to say about Olwen. After working the moves out, I went for the lead fairly quickly and got it at first red point. I felt secure and safe for the majority of the climb, with the only dangerous moves being on the easier section. I still don't have much experience or depth of knowledge on grading at this level, but for me, it felt quite a bit easier and less committing than the other E9s I've done or tried. Jim's obviously on incredible form at the moment, and he's got one World Cup to go, after which he's going to go and climb in the Dolomites and the Alps, and I've no doubt he'll have successful trips within each, and I look forward to reporting on what he's done when he's done it.